Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm Alexis Edberg. I'm the marketing manager at Ecolab on hand hygiene here. I'm joined by Yamini Karandikar, who is my counterpart in our research and development department, also focused on hand hygiene. And this morning, we're here to talk to you about the important role that hand hygiene plays in delivering food safety. So what we want to start with today is really talking about that role that hand hygiene plays and what a critical component it is to delivering safe food in your kitchens every day. From there, Yamini will discuss some of the key organisms of concern that can be spread by hands in kitchens. And then we'll talk a little bit about compliance, including both products and procedures, which we know is so key in delivering food safety. Finally, we know that compliance can be a challenge, so we'll talk about some of the barriers that you may face and ways to overcome those. Hopefully giving you some actionable steps to take out of this and help to improve hand hygiene in your establishments. So if you're making the time to attend this webinar, then it's likely you're already well aware of the important role that food safety plays in your operation. Currently, based on data from the CDC, we know that 1 out of 6 Americans get sick each year from consuming contaminated foods or beverages. That's 48 million people. In today's internet-connected world, consumer focus on this continues to increase. People expect the places they frequent to provide safe food, but a study published by the USDA found that nearly half of people don't think that food service establishments are doing enough to achieve this. This is particularly concerning for the 30% of individuals that are especially at risk for foodborne illness. This includes young children, senior citizens, and pregnant women. And based on our demographic trends, we know that this at-risk population will continue to grow, making the importance of food safety even greater as we move toward the future. In addition to impacting your customer safety, outbreaks of foodborne illness can also have devastating impacts on your bottom line. Data from the National Restaurant Association show that between legal fees, medical claims, lost wages, and sanitizing costs, an outbreak costs an average of $75,000 per establishment. And I'm sure you know it can also have a lasting impact on your reputation, your customers, and your sales that can be very difficult to bounce back from. So how does hand hygiene play into this? Well, we see here in the data from the CDC that poor personal hygiene is the #1 contributor to foodborne illness. Although we often think of when we think of food safety, we often think about procedures like proper cooking and holding temperatures or food contaminated at the source. We know these are also important causes, but poor personal hygiene really tops the list in terms of contributions. More specifically, when we look at restaurants, we see that 2.6 million foodborne illnesses develop in the U.S. each year from bare hand contact with food prepared at restaurants. Of the outbreaks of contributing factors reported, bare hand contact is only the second most common, behind handling of food by an infected person. The good news is that by making hand hygiene a priority in your facility, you can help to reduce these risks. Ultimately, hand hygiene comes down to compliance, which relies on the behavior of your staff. We know that this can make it hard to control, but the good news is that it is something that you can impact. If you make food safety and frequent compliant hand washing a priority, it will become a part of the routine for your employees. One of the first steps in making hand hygiene a priority is education. Unless hands actually feel dirty, many people don't think about what's on them and what they may be spreading or cross-contaminating within the restaurant or within the kitchen. Since germs can be present without being seen or felt, hands provide a great opportunity for them to spread. In fact, an estimated 80% of all infections are spread by hands. It's important to note that germs on hands don't just spread to the first thing that you touch. Some germs, including those that cause foodborne illness, can live on moist surfaces for up to 3 days. And norovirus, which we know is a huge concern, can live even longer than that. So how do you train your staff on these invisible threats? Well, one approach is to help them visualize contamination. A study done by the infection control team at Henry Ford Health System showed that hand hygiene compliance increased between 11 and 46% after showing workers images of bacterial cultures of similar levels of contamination to what was found on their hands. So this kind of yuck factor of visualizing those germs can be really impactful for people. Now, Yamini will provide more detail on the types of foodborne illness-causing bacteria that are often found in kitchens and spread by hands.
Thanks, Alexis. So there are 5 main pathogens that contribute to foodborne illness. These big 5 were determined based on how easily they're transmitted by food workers and the severity of illness that these pathogens can cause to develop. So on the left, you can see norovirus, Shigella, and hepatitis A. These primarily enter a food service establishment through people, these people being employees or customers. On the right side, you've got E. coli and Salmonella. These primarily enter a food service establishment through contaminated food, such as meat, produce, or water that was contaminated at the source. So that means that the food was contaminated before it even got to the food service establishment. What the big 5 really have in common is that these can all be spread by hand. So I'm going to go a little more in depth on each pathogen and focus on the impact that each of these pathogens have. All right, so the first pathogen I want to talk about today is norovirus, which has been getting some media attention lately. It's a highly contagious viral infection, and it affects your digestive system. And what makes controlling norovirus especially difficult is that it is really hardy and it can live outside the body for weeks. Norovirus is found in the feces or vomit of an infected person, and it spreads through what we call the fecal-oral route, so through feces, through vomit. So it has a very serious impact on public health, as it's the #1 cause of foodborne illness in the U.S. One thing that really causes it to spread is that a person is contagious both before and after symptoms show. So just because someone is feeling better doesn't mean that they should necessarily go back to work. And actually, the average person can get norovirus 5 times during their life. So just because you've gotten sick from norovirus once doesn't mean you can't get it again. So because of all these factors, preventing the spread of norovirus is essential, especially in a food service setting. The best way to combat the spread of norovirus is to really focus on restroom hygiene because of the way it's spread through the fecal-oral route and practicing frequent hand washing. Okay. So next up is Shigella, which is an infectious bacterial disease. And some of the symptoms it causes are diarrhea, fever, and stomach cramps. There are 500,000 cases of Shigella every year, so it's definitely a pathogen of concern, especially in a food service setting, as it's easily transmitted by hand. And preventing the spread of Shigella really relies on proper hand hygiene practices. The third pathogen that primarily enters a food service setting through people is hepatitis A. Hep A is another highly contagious viral infection, and this causes liver disease, so it's a little different than norovirus and Shigella. It affects a different part of your body. And what's really alarming about Hep A is that it can live outside the body for months. And looking at how Hep A affects public health, there aren't a large number of cases, and one of the reasons this is because that there is a vaccine available for Hep A. However, Hep A is still a pathogen of concern in food service because it's transmittable 2 weeks before someone shows symptoms, and it's oftentimes actually asymptomatic. So you might be carrying the disease and not have symptoms and be spreading it to other people. If a person does get Hep A, the recovery process can be very long, and symptoms can last up to 6 months. So although the number of cases a year is not very high, it's still a pathogen of concern due to the nature of the illness and the fact that it's so hardy and can live outside the body for so long. Right. Next up is E. coli. This is a bacteria that causes diarrhea and cramps, and it affects your intestine, and it can actually severely damage the lining of your intestine. E. coli primarily enters a food service establishment through food contaminated directly at the source. Once it's at a food service establishment, it can spread further through cross-contamination, where someone's hands can act as a vector. For example, if contaminated beef enters a restaurant and someone who's working with the beef doesn't properly wash their hands and touches some lettuce afterwards, the bacteria has then gone from the beef to the person's hands and then to the lettuce, and this is what results in that cross-contamination. E. coli can also be spread if contaminated food is undercooked or not cooked at all. The impact of E. coli is that it results in 2,000 hospitalizations every year. And people such as the children or elderly in those at-risk populations can actually develop kidney failure. Preventing the spread of E. coli in food service is really essential and can be prevented through proper hand washing, glove procedures, and adequate cooking of food. All right. And then lastly, we're going to look at salmonella. You've probably heard of salmonella in association with food poisoning and eggs. This is a bacteria that causes diarrhea, fever, and cramps, and it's spread in a very similar manner to E. coli. Salmonella causes 1 million cases of foodborne illness every year. So this is a big pathogen in the food service industry. The illness can last up to a week, and depending on the severity of the diarrhea and resulting dehydration, hospitalization can be required, especially if the sick person is in that at-risk population. So now that we've covered the 5 main food service pathogens, I want to look at a specific case of a foodborne outbreak. So potential sources of an outbreak can be really tough to determine. In this specific case, there was an employee who had norovirus and returned to work immediately after their symptoms had stopped. The sink the food worker used to wash and prepare lettuce was also used for hand washing, and the sink was not sanitized before or after washing the lettuce. So this provided the opportunity for the lettuce to become contaminated with norovirus. The impact of this outbreak is that 170 people fell sick, and the restaurant actually had to close down twice to be cleaned and sanitized. So some lessons learned from this case is that employees should really be encouraged to stay home even after their symptoms resolve, especially if they have norovirus, because they can be contagious for 3 days after their symptoms go away. It also really highlights the importance of compliance and proper hand hygiene procedures. In this case, a hand wash sink that should really only have been used for hand washing was also used to wash produce. And this way, the germs were able to get from the hands onto the produce. So it's really important to focus on that compliance piece when we're talking about hand hygiene. So now that we've talked through all the different pathogens that can impact health, safety, and public image of your restaurant, we want to talk more about prevention. And to prevent the spread of germs, it's really important to focus on compliance and use the right procedures and the right products.
All right, so as we look at choosing the right products, I know we've gotten a lot of questions since the FDA over-the-counter consumer monograph came out last September. And this monograph that the FDA put out was really focused on consumer products and specifically one ingredient of concern, triclosan, as well as 18 other less frequently used ingredients. So this monograph bans the use of triclosan as of this September, so coming up next month. One important note here is that the ruling does not apply to food handlers and healthcare workers. The FDA has defined these two groups as completely separate categories that they are ruling on independently. We are expecting a ruling for healthcare workers to come out in January of 2018, and no date has been set at this point for food handlers. But this ruling does apply to places that consumers frequent, like facilities and public spaces. So no matter what type of space you're operating in, if you're looking to avoid triclosan-based hand soaps, the good news is that effective and FDA-compliant antibacterial soaps without triclosan are available. So we would recommend talking to your supplier about what those alternatives are that can still give you great performance and protection. So at Ecolab, we do still recommend antibacterial hand soap for an extra level of protection in food service settings, and I'll talk about why that is. So although we've heard for consumers that antibacterial soap may not be more effective than plain soap, the food service environment is different. We know that here potential health risks due to bacterial transfer from hands increase exponentially. We also know that antibacterial hand wash products can help to reduce these risks by helping to eliminate or inhibit bacteria that cause foodborne illness. Additionally, studies indicate that antibacterial soaps are more effective, and this is supported by the findings of a review of 24 relevant published studies featured in the Journal of Food Protection, showing that antibacterial soaps did provide a statistically significant greater reduction in bacteria than plain soap and water. So, bottom line is we are still recommending antibacterial soaps for this higher risk environment where you have people that are touching food that impacts many, many more people, and in an environment where they have a much higher level of contamination present on their hands potentially. But no matter what product you're using, compliance really comes down to procedures. So it's all about washing at the right times and in the right way.
Right. So there are specific events that really trigger the act of hand washing. The U.S. FDA recommends that hands are washed after these specific events. So before engaging in food prep or touching produce, before entering a food prep area, and before touching any utensils or cookware. From a personal hygiene perspective, it's recommended to wash your hands after using the bathroom, after touching exposed skin or hair. This one's particularly difficult because people can unconsciously touch their hair or their face, but it's still really important to make sure you wash your hands after doing so, and again, after using tobacco. A few other times to wash your hands are before putting on gloves, after touching soiled equipment or wear that's visibly greasy or dirty, and then when going from touching raw food to ready-to-eat food is another time you want to be washing your hands. So now you know when hands should be washed. I want to take a look at when it's appropriate to use a hand sanitizer. So hand washing is the act of using soap and water together, and this is really the best way to reduce the number of microbes on your hands. Hand washing and hand sanitizing are not the same, and this is because hand sanitizing is not effective when your hands are greasy or dirty, and hand sanitizing doesn't remove germs or remove soil. But there is an appropriate time and place to use a hand sanitizer, and you really want to use a hand sanitizer in addition to hand washing. So what you want to do is wash your hands first and then use a hand sanitizer to further reduce your risk. In a food service setting, it's important to use a food-safe hand sanitizer, and your supplier can help assist you in choosing and making sure you're using the right product for the right setting. Next, I want to share a video that demonstrates the proper procedure for washing hands, and it will go step by step in order of how to do so. All right, so start by turning on the water, rinse your hands, and then apply soap. Rub your hands together for 10 to 15 seconds, and this is where a lot of people go wrong. They don't wash their hands for long enough. Make sure you rub your thumbs, scrub your palms, and wash between your fingers, and pay special attention to the wrist area. Rinse your hands, and then dry using a paper towel or a hot air. And then also use a paper towel to touch any nearby surfaces around the hand sink to avoid recontaminating your hands. And if available, use a hand sanitizer and rub your hands together to make sure all the surfaces of your hands and nails are covered, and rub the hand sanitizer in until dry. So hand hygiene procedures seem easy in theory. Everyone saw the video. It's not that difficult. But the truth is, proper procedures are not always observed, and hand hygiene compliance continues to be a challenge.
So studies have shown that a shocking 95% of people don't wash their hands adequately, and 33% of people don't use soap when washing their hands. So given that we've seen the procedures, we know what we're supposed to do, what are the barriers? Why is this so difficult to people, and how do we address them? We want to get into what are some of the big things out there that are keeping people from compliance, and what you can do to really help encourage compliance in your establishment. So the first barrier is really around knowledge gaps and just true understanding of how does what I touch impact the spread of pathogens and possibly impact the bottom line of the establishment that I'm working in. So in order to break through this barrier, we really see the number one thing is that tone at the top. If you as a manager or as a leader encouraging your managers to make hand hygiene a priority, know that your actions will influence how your employees behave and perceive hand hygiene. You'll also want to make sure that you're offering truly comprehensive training, not just showing what the procedures are, when you need to wash, how long you need to wash for, but why that's important. Sharing some of the statistics around the incidence of foodborne illness, the impact that it can have on a business, and although a lot of people feel like it's never going to happen to me, when it does, it's truly devastating. And finally, emphasizing that training with visual aids will help ensure that procedures and the impacts of hand hygiene stay fresh in the minds of employees. You can also consider showing visuals of germs, as we discussed earlier, that can help to make them think about the invisible things that are on their hands. Secondly, we often hear we know what a time crunch there is, particularly in restaurants and food service right now. Employees are really stretched. They're saying there's not enough time, or they're saying from all of the hand washing, my hands are chapped, I don't want to wash anymore. Or another barrier that we often see is with glove use, people don't feel that yuck factor on their hands. They don't think about the need to wash every time they change gloves. So in order to break through this, we really recommend doing as much as you can to make things convenient for people. So the first thing to consider is your sink placement and really the layout of your restaurant. So if you have the luxury of a new build, thinking about where you put those hand sinks. If you're in your current establishment, thinking about just like the layout of where you're preparing things, making hand sinks as obvious as possible and easy for staff to get to. Secondly, thinking about the ease of refills. A big barrier can be the soap runs out, everybody's in the middle of a rush, and nobody wants to take the time to replace it. So just making sure that you have refills, that refills are a part of your routine and something that you're taking care of and have a plan around managing, and also making refills easy to access. Finally, regarding skin health, making sure that you're choosing products that contain moisturizers or skin conditioners that can help improve that for hands. Also following the proper procedure. If you're rinsing your hands with water before applying the soap, that can actually help to limit the amount of drying that's happening. Also making lotion available for employees is something that they can use before going on break or after their shift, can help to make sure that they're taking care of skin health. Finally, hand hygiene can just be easy to forget for some people, even though they know it's important, they're in a rush, just providing those constant reminders as a way to help people make sure that this stays top of mind. So the first thing to consider here, and this can really help, especially with that issue of washing between changing gloves, think about wash frequency. You may want to enforce a certain number of washes per hour for employees, encouraging them to make sure that even if their hands don't necessarily feel dirty, that they're still washing at the appropriate times. Another tool that you can use is signage. So making sure you have eye-catching signs, emphasizing the importance, also helping to just make people stop and think about it when they're in the middle of running from one thing to another. And by changing out those signs frequently, you can help to make sure that they're still catching attention and not just blending into the background. And finally, we recommend just trying to make hand hygiene fun for employees. This can include ongoing training or potentially contests around hand hygiene. One tool that's an example of this we have is called DigiGlow. We have this kit that comes with 2 4-ounce bottles of a lotion that glows under black light, along with the black light and everything you need to perform the testing. So you would have employees put the lotion on, show that the lotion glows on their hands under the black light, then have them wash their hands, and you can have them compete to see who can remove all of the germ from their hands in an appropriate and compliant hand wash, then check again with the black light afterwards, which kind of emphasizes making sure that they're hitting all of the right spots and also makes it fun. So our call to action here is really go out and remove the barriers. This is something that you have the power to impact. So first, start with educating employees, helping them understand the link between hand hygiene and foodborne illness, ensuring that you're setting the proper tone at the top and that making hand hygiene a priority and modeling good behavior for employees, making hand sinks and soap refills convenient, and then keeping it top of mind with signs, contests, and continuing education. So with that, we will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Alexis and Yamini. We did have a couple questions come in. First of all, what are the active ingredients that are still approved by the FDA for antibacterial hand soap?
So the ingredients that are still approved, one is PCMX, and another is benzalkonium chloride, or QUAT, which QUAT in some cases has been known to be difficult to foam, and Ecolab has actually recently launched new advanced antibacterial hand soaps containing a QUAT active ingredient that have excellent foam quality, a pleasant fragrance, and are gentle on hands.
Are there training films to show employees periodically the importance of hand hygiene, either through Ecolab or the CDC or another source?
Yes, absolutely. At Ecolab, we're actually working on building out our hand hygiene training currently, and you should be able to see more coming from us this fall on that topic. But currently there are videos available, I believe, from the CDC on this topic. So it's something to definitely consult with your supplier about in terms of what they can provide, and also there are online resources available.
How do we get our staff to understand the importance of washing in between glove changes?
That's a great question. This can be a really tricky one. As we mentioned, I think gloves often provide this false sense of security. But I believe in showing them the way that germs can transfer from one thing to another. That can help them to understand that as they're taking the gloves off, putting the gloves on, they are still touching things that will eventually touch the food and can spread those types of pathogens. I think the enforcing of hand washing a certain number of times per hour is another one that can help to really get employees to make sure that they're washing their hands in between glove changes.
And we also had a follow-up question to that one, Alexis.
Mm-hmm.
When using gloves, what is a good rule of thumb for washing hands? Should hands be washed after every glove change or just periodically?
I believe according to the FDA, do you want to
Yeah, so according to the FDA, anytime you change your gloves, hands should be washed. And that was one of the triggers of hand washing that I shared earlier.
And do you have a recommended temperature people should be using for hand washing?
Yeah, that's actually been a hot topic lately. Recently, studies came out showing that water temperature really doesn't impact the efficacy of hand washing. However, at this point, we do still need to follow food code recommendations in kitchens. So at this point, the food code recommends 100 degrees Fahrenheit. I believe that is being reviewed at this point as based on the new research that's come out. As some people are saying that just using the most comfortable water temperature is what's going to encourage employees to wash most frequently. But at this point, in order to make sure that you're passing inspection, you should still have 100 degrees Fahrenheit water.
We have time for just a couple more. What was the kit that was called with the black light?
Yeah, absolutely. That is our DigiGlow kit available from Ecolab. So the kit comes with 2 4-ounce bottles of the Glow lotion, a blacklight flashlight with batteries, and instructions for how to perform the test. And that's something that you can order to use as training with your employees, or you can also ask your Ecolab associate to bring that in and do a training with your team.
And then one last question is, where do we get a copy of the video on the various bacteria to show to employees for maximum impact? Yamini, you mentioned the visual of showing some of the bacteria.
So do they want a copy of the presentation? Or
do you have any recommendations where they can get that visual impact of bacteria?
That's definitely something we can follow up on. I think in the study, they had specifically taken cultures and then showed people cultures that were similar to the level of contamination that was on their hands. But I think just in searching online, you can find images amplified of some of those pathogens of things found on hands. So I just recommend an online search.
That's all the time we have for questions today. Alexis, we'll turn it back to you for some closing thoughts.
Perfect. So just final thoughts regarding this presentation. I hope that you've seen that hand hygiene really is the leading contributor to foodborne illness, and that compliance is key to reducing your risks. I think the good news here is that this is something that you can influence and really help to encourage with your staff in order to make an impact and reduce your risks. So our closing advice is really to make sure that you make it a priority, make it convenient, and keep it top of mind.
Great. Well, we want to thank everyone for joining us today on the call. We had a couple questions coming in about availability of the presentation, and it will be available at ecolab.com this Friday on August 11th. You'll also get a link to that in a follow-up email. Please don't forget, after this survey concludes, after this webinar concludes, there is a survey we'd like you to take, and that is also where you can request your continuing education certificates, in which we can follow up. Our next Food Safety Matters webinar is on Tuesday, November 14th at 10 a.m. Central Time, and you'll be watching our email box for details on how to register, or you can go to ecolab.com and register today. Again, thank you everyone for your time, and we look forward to speaking to you at our next webinar. Thank you.